Everyone laughed at the scullery maid for taking in a limping old beggar woman freezing at the manor gates. They mocked her, threatened her with the workhouse, and warned she'd lose everything. What none of them knew, the old woman was the lost mother of the Duke himself, and he had just come home. The snow had been falling since before dawn, and Serafina's hands had long since stopped feeling like her own. She knelt on the cobblestones at the servants' entrance of Blackwood Manor, a wooden brush in one raw fist, scrubbing ice and coal grime from the steps that led down into the kitchens. Her knees had gone numb through the thin linen of her gown an hour ago. Her breath came out in pale clouds and vanished into the gray Yorkshire morning. Behind her, through the kitchen door, came the warm clatter of pots and the smell of mutton turning on the spit, a warmth she was not permitted to enjoy until the steps were clean enough that Mrs. Crabbe could find no fault in them. And Mrs. Crabbe always found fault. Serafina dipped the brush again. The water in her pail had a skin of ice on it. She did not hear the old woman approach. She only heard the sound of someone falling. It was a soft sound, almost gentle. A bundle of rags folding down against the iron gate at the top of the lane. Serafina turned and saw her, a frail figure wrapped in wool so filthy and torn it was hard to say what color it had once been. The woman's face was the color of cold ash. One leg dragged behind her at a wrong angle, and her lips moved without much sound coming out. "Please," the old woman whispered when Serafina drew near. "Only a hearth, only an hour by a fire. I have walked a very long way." Serafina's heart turned over in her chest. She had known hunger. She had known cold that made you weep without deciding to. She crouched, and the old woman's hand found her wrist and gripped it with a strength that did not match the rest of her, desperate, bony, like a bird's claw. "Who's this, then?" The voice came from the doorway. Mrs. Crabbe, the head housekeeper, stood with her keys jingling at her waist and her mouth already set in its familiar hard line. Behind her, 2 footmen in their blue livery had come out to look, grinning the way men grin when they expect to be entertained at someone else's expense. "A beggar at the gate," said the taller footman, James. "Look at the state of it." "An insolvent vagrant," Mrs. Crabbe corrected, as though precision mattered. She came down 2 steps, careful not to dirty her hem. "We've had 3 this week. They smell the kitchen and they come like cats." She raised her voice at the huddled woman as if loudness would carry meaning. "Off with you! There's a workhouse in Pickering will take your sort. Or shall we send James for the parish beadle? He'll drag you there himself and glad of the walk." The footman laughed. The old woman flinched at the sound of it and seemed to grow smaller inside her rags. Something rose in Serafina then that was older and stronger than fear, though fear was certainly there too. She knew exactly what she stood to lose. A scullery maid turned out without a character reference did not find another place. She begged, or she went to the workhouse herself, or she went to the streets, and she had seen what became of girls who went to the streets. She knew all of this in the half-second before she stood up. She stood up anyway. "She'll die in this cold," Serafina said. "Look at her leg. She can't even walk to Pickering, let alone be dragged there." Mrs. Crabbe turned to her slowly, and the laughter behind her stopped. "I beg your pardon. It's Christian charity to take her in for an hour. The master himself would say so." "The master," said Mrs. Crabbe with a thin smile, "is in London, and you are a scullery maid, and you will hold your tongue, or you will follow this creature out the gate and see how you like the moor by nightfall." For one long moment, Serafina stood very still. The snow fell between them. James was watching with open interest now, the way a boy watches 2 dogs decide whether to fight. Then Serafina unpinned the heavy wool shawl from her own shoulders, the only warm thing she owned, a gift from her dead mother, the one possession in all the world that was truly hers. and she knelt and wrapped it around the shaking old woman. "You'll regret this, girl," Mrs. Crab said, very quietly, and quiet was always worse than shouting from her. "Then I'll regret it warm," Serafina said, "and she'll be alive." She got an arm beneath the woman's shoulders. The old creature weighed almost nothing, like a bundle of dry kindling. James moved as if to stop her, and Mrs. Crab lifted one hand. "Let her," that hand said. "Let her dig her own grave." And so no one stopped Serafina at all as she half-carried, half-dragged the stranger past the grinning footman, past the housekeeper's cold stare, through the kitchen where the cook gaped, and down the narrow stone stairs, into the dark. She did not take her to the kitchen fire. She knew better. She took her down the second set of stairs, the ones nobody used, into the subterranean dark where the great iron boilers breathed their heat and no one ever came. Behind them, faintly, she heard James say, "She's gone soft in the head." She had not. She had simply decided that whatever this cost her, and it would cost her everything, she was sure of that, it would not be paid by leaving an old woman to freeze at a rich man's gate. She had no idea yet whose gate it truly was. The boiler room was the one place in Blackwood Manor that was always warm. Serafina knew this the way she knew everything about the house's hidden bones, through years of being sent where no one else would go. Behind the great iron boilers, where the heat pressed close and the dark was thick as wool, there was a forgotten storage nook. Once it had held wine. Now it held broken crates, a few moldering sacks, and a stillness so deep that even Mrs. Crab's keys never jingled this far down. She settled the old woman on a bed she made from empty grain sacks and the last of the dry kindling. From the pocket beneath her apron, she drew 3 tallow candles, a fortnight's allowance, hoarded for the long winter nights when the dormitory went black at 8. She lit one. The small flame leaned and steadied, and in its light she saw at last how bad the woman's legs truly were. The skin below the knee had blistered and split. 2 toes had gone the waxy white of frostbite, and the right ankle was swollen to twice its size, the bone beneath sitting wrong. Serafina had nursed scalds and chilblains for half the underservants in the house, and she knew this was beyond her. Still, she did what she could. She tore a clean strip from her own petticoat, warmed water at the boiler's flank in a chipped jug, and bathed the wounds with a gentleness the old woman seemed unused to, for she wept a little at the kindness of it. "You shouldn't have done it," the woman murmured. "They'll turn you out." "Then they'll turn me out." Serafina pressed dry bread into her hand and tipped the jug so she could sip the thin broth she'd smuggled in the fold of her apron, still warm from the pot the cook had turned her back on. "Eat. Words can wait. Bread can't." The woman ate the way the truly starved eat, slowly, with great care, as though afraid the food might be taken from her halfway. When she had finished, she lay back against the sacks and studied Serafina's face for a long, strange moment. Something in the look made the girl uneasy. It was not the gaze of a vagrant. It was steady, and it weighed her. "What is your name, child?"
"Serafina, ma'am."
"Serafina." The old woman repeated it as if filing it somewhere safe. "You have given me your shawl, your candles, your bread, and your place in this house. You have given me everything you own and asked me for nothing. Do you know how rare that is in this world?"
"You needed it more than I did. There's nothing rare in that."
The woman was quiet. The boiler ticked and breathed. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Not weaker, but lower, and more careful, like someone stepping onto ice. "I am going to tell you something, and you will think me mad. The asylum thought me mad. They are very good at making a woman seem mad when it suits them." She drew a slow breath. "My name is Rosalind, Lady Rosalind Blackwood. I am I was the Dowager Duchess of this house. This house. These gates I crawled to are my own. Serafina sat very still. The candle flame did not move.
The Duchess died, she said carefully. Years ago. Highwaymen. Everyone knows it. The whole county wore black for a month.
The whole county was told a lie. The old woman's eyes shone, and there was no madness in them that Serafina could find, only a grief that had been carried too far, too long. There were no highwaymen, child. The carriage was stopped by men who had been paid. I was not killed. I was taken north, to a private asylum on the coast, and given another woman's name, and locked behind a door for years that I lost count of. They told the staff I was a merchant's wife, sick in the head, prone to fancies of grandeur. A bitter, broken sound that was almost a laugh. I told them every day that I was a duchess. You can imagine how that helped my case.
How did you? Serafina's voice came out a whisper.
A new physician, a careless undernurse, a door left unbolted in the confusion of a fever that ran through the place and took half of them. She looked down at her ruined legs. I have walked and begged and hidden in ditches for longer than these feet were willing. I came back for one reason only, my son. He was 16 when they took me. He believes his mother is in the family vault. He does not know there is nothing in it but a weighted coffin and a lie. Serafina's mouth had gone dry. The names she was hearing did not belong in a coal cellar. They belonged on the marble tablets in the village church, on the iron gates above, on the seal pressed into the letters that came for the master.
And your son,
she said slowly, already half knowing, dreading the knowing,
is the Duke of Blackwood.
The old woman closed her eyes.
Ethan, she said. His name is Ethan, and by every account that reached even my locked room, he is breaking his heart for a grave that holds no one at all.
The Duke of Blackwood was not expected for another week. The household learned otherwise at 11:30, when the great bell at the carriage drive clanged through the snow, and a travel-stained coach came up the avenue faster than was wise on iced gravel. Serafina, slipping along the back passages with an empty jug, heard the commotion break out above her. Running feet, Mrs. Crabb's voice climbing to a pitch reserved for emergencies, the scramble of footmen pulling on coats they'd half shed for the night. He had ridden ahead of his own letters. He often did. In the grand library, the fire was hastily built and the candles thrown into hurried life. Ethan, Duke of Blackwood, came in still wearing his greatcoat, the heavy velvet black with melted snow across the shoulders.
He was not yet 30, but there was a grayness about him that had nothing to do with age. A man worn thin from the inside, the way wood goes when water has been in it too long. He waved off the offered supper, the warmed bed, the fussing. He wanted the room emptied and the fire lit and nothing else. Parliament had wearied him. London had wearied him. The whole of his life, by the look of him, had wearied him. And he had come home to the one place where his grief, at least, had familiar walls. He did not sleep. He never slept the first night home. He sat with a glass he did not drink and stared at the portrait above the hearth, a fair, laughing woman in pale silk, painted long ago, her eyes following him about the room as they had followed him since he was a boy. Which is why he was awake to hear the drawing-room door across the hall ease open. Serafina had not wanted to come up into the main house. She had argued with herself the whole way along the cold passages. But Lady Rosalind's legs had worsened through the evening, the swelling climbing, the woman drifting in and out of a sleep too heavy to be restful, and Serafina knew of only one thing in Blackwood Manor strong enough to dull that kind of pain. The laudanum kept locked in the drawing-room cabinet for the master's headaches. She had no key. She had a thin blade of a kitchen knife and a desperation that made her brave and clumsy at once. She was working the cabinet lock when the candlelight changed behind her.
"Thieves," said a low voice, "usually wait until a house is asleep, not until it has only just woken." She spun. The Duke stood in the doorway with a branch of candles in his hand, and she had never been so close to him in her life, this man whose food she scrubbed pans for, whose floors she crawled across before dawn. His face was hard and tired and entirely unreadable. A scullery maid caught at a gentleman's cabinet with a knife in her hand had one future, and it wore irons. Serafina knew this. She did not let go of the knife, and she did not look away from him. And that, the not looking away, was what made him pause. Servants did not meet his eyes. This one did, and hers were wet and furious and frightened all at once, and underneath the fright was something he had not seen in a long time on any face in this house. Defiance, with a reason behind it. "I'm not stealing for myself," she said. "I swear it on my mother's grave, I'm not." "They all say something close to that." "Then send for the magistrate." Her voice shook, but did not fall. "Send for him. Only first, come and see what I've got hidden in your cellar, and then send for whoever you like, and I won't say a word against it." It was such a strange thing to say that the Duke did not answer for a moment. A guilty servant begged. A guilty servant wept and invented a sick mother. This one was inviting him deeper into the house, toward the very thing she'd been caught stealing for, as if she wanted to be followed. "My cellar," he repeated. "There's a woman down there. She's hurt, and she's old, and she came to your gates today half dead, and your housekeeper would have had the beadle drag her to the workhouse." Serafina's chin came up. "I took her in. I'll answer for that and the lock and all of it. But she needs the laudanum tonight, or she may not see morning, and I'll not stand here bargaining for my own neck while she suffers for it." The grief in him stirred. He could not have said why. Something in the shape of the words. A stranger at the gates, an old woman half dead in the snow, turned away. He thought of the painted face above his fire, the carriage on the moor road, the years. He should have rung for the footman. He knew it even as he failed to do it. "Show me," the Duke said instead, and set down his candles and followed the scullery maid into the dark. The stairs down to the boiler room were not made for a Duke. Ethan followed the maid through passages he had not walked since he was a boy, playing at hide-and-seek with a nursemaid long since dead. The air thickened and warmed. He had to stoop beneath a beam. He thought, with the grim humor of a tired man, that he had ridden through a night and a day to come home, and was now being led into his own foundations by a servant with a stolen knife, and that nothing in his life had felt this strange in years, and that he did not, oddly, want to turn back. Then he heard the voice. It came from beyond the boilers, thin and drifting up out of a half-sleep. A few murmured words, broken, the way the very ill talk to people who are not there. He stopped on the bottom step as though he had walked into a wall. The branch of candles shook in Serafina's hand and threw the shadows wide. "That voice," he said. It came out of him strangely, not like his own. "She's been talking in her sleep since the swelling worsened," Serafina said. "I couldn't make sense of most of it. She keeps saying a name." But he was already moving past her, fast, careless of the low beam that caught his shoulder, into the warm dark behind the iron. The old woman lay on her bed of sacks, eyes half open, the candlelight gilding a face that hunger and years had carved nearly to the bone. Ethan went down onto his knees on the filthy stone without seeming to know he had done it. He did not speak for a long moment. He only looked, the way a man looks at a thing he has wanted so long that he no longer trusts his own eyes to have found it. "Mother," he said. The word cracked in the middle. Lady Rosalind's gaze drifted, found him, sharpened. A ruined hand lifted from the sacking and reached, trembling, and touched his face, the jaw, the cheekbone, mapping it the way the blind map what they already love.
"You've grown so like your father," she whispered. "I always feared you would. He frowned exactly so."
What followed, Serafina would never afterward be able to describe to anyone, and she did not try. A man who had worn his grief like iron for years simply broke, there on the cold floor of his own cellar, his fine head bowed against his mother's wasted hands, and wept without any care at all for who saw it. The old woman wept too, but quietly, stroking his hair, murmuring that she was here, that it had been a lie, all of it a lie, that she had walked the length of the country to tell him so. When at last he lifted his face, he turned and looked at Serafina, truly looked, as though seeing the whole of her for the first time. The maid with the knife. The maid who had given a freezing stranger her own shawl and her own bread and her own place in the world, asking nothing, not even knowing. "You did not know who she was," he said. It was not a question. "I knew she was cold," Serafina answered. "That was enough to be going on with." He had no words for that. He had wealth enough to buy a county, and no words at all for a scullery maid who had spent her last candle on a beggar. Something moved in him that had nothing to do with gratitude and everything to do with it at once, and he looked away from her because the look had become too large to hold. It was then that they heard the bolt. Not a key, a bolt, the heavy outer bolt of the cellar door, the one that had not been drawn in living memory, slamming home through its iron staple with a sound like a pistol shot. Ethan was on his feet at once. Footsteps moved away above them, unhurried, the steps of a man who had no reason to run. "Who knows you came down here?" Lady Rosalind's voice had changed. The weakness had gone out of it. Old instinct, long buried, had woken in her face. "No one," Ethan said. "I emptied the library myself." "Someone knew." She gripped Serafina's wrist. "Child, listen to me. The man who paid the highwaymen, the man who has run this estate's moneys all these years while believing me dead, he did not act alone for nothing. He acted for control. And if he has just now learned I am breathing under his own floor—" A voice came down through the boards above, smooth and quite without haste. Serafina knew it. The whole house knew it. Mr. Hargrave, the land steward, who kept the ledgers and the keys and the magistrate's good opinion. "Your Grace," it called pleasantly through the wood, "I'm afraid there's been an uprising among the servants, a dangerous business. Constables are already sent for. I do urge you to stay exactly where you are, for your own safety, of course." In the candlelight, Ethan's face turned to stone. "He means to bury all three of us," he said quietly, "and call it a riot." The bolt held. Ethan threw his weight against the door twice and learned only that the door had been built to keep wine safe from thieves, which meant it kept dukes very well too. "You'll bruise your shoulder and nothing else," Lady Rosalind said. "Hargrave has thought about this longer than we have. He has been thinking about it for years." Above them, the manor had begun to make the wrong sounds. Not the ordinary morning clatter of a great house waking, but boots, many of them, heavy, moving with purpose through rooms where servants usually crept. Hargrave's voice carried now and then, calm and reasonable, telling someone that the master had been taken hostage by a mad maidservant, that no man should enter the cellar without a pistol drawn, that the Duke's safety depended on swift and quiet work. He was building the story even now, plank by plank, so that whatever was found down here later would already have its explanation waiting. Ethan turned from the useless door. "There is no other way out of this room." "There is no other door," Serafina said. He looked at her. So did his mother. Serafina had spent 4 years being sent where no one else would go, up chimneys with a brush, down wells with a pail, into the crawling spaces behind walls to chase the rats Mrs. Crabbe would not abide. She knew the manor the way a surgeon knows the inside of a body,
not from drawings, but from having had her hands in it. She crossed the warm dark to the far corner behind the largest boiler, where the heat was fiercest and the soot lay thickest, and she pressed her palm flat against a square of blackened iron set low in the wall. "The old laundry once stood above this room," she said. "When they built the new wash-house, they bricked off the chute, but they never filled it. The girls used to dare each other to climb it. It runs up through the wall, narrow, foul, but it comes out behind the linen presses on the first landing. From there, the priest's stair goes down past the chapel, and the chapel door gives onto the stable yard." She worked her fingers into a seam none of them had seen. "Hargrave knows the house from its ledgers. He doesn't know it from its dirt. I do." The iron plate gave with a shriek of rust, and beyond it, the chute breathed cold soot into the warm room. It was a cruel climb. Serafina went first, bracing her back against one wall and her bare feet against the other, hauling herself up into a blackness that pressed in close enough to taste. Below her, Ethan stripped off his snow-heavy greatcoat, then his fine coat, because neither would fit through, and he tied his cravat into a loop and passed it down for his mother to hold. Lady Rosalind could not climb. He carried her, her thin arms about his neck, his shoulders scraping raw against brick that had not been touched in 30 years, and he made no sound at all, though Serafina, just above, heard the breath go ragged in him with every foot they gained. Halfway up, the soot got into the old woman's throat, and she began to cough, and the cough echoed in the flue like a struck bell. Serafina froze. Far below, through the open plate, she heard a voice in the boiler room say, "What was that?" and another say, "Only the pipes, the boilers always knock." And she shut her eyes and prayed to a god she was not sure attended to scullery maids. And after a moment, the men below moved on, satisfied, to wait by the bolted door for prey that was no longer in the trap. They came out behind the linen presses, choking and black, 3 soot ghosts on a quiet landing, while the hunt went on in the wrong part of the house. Serafina led them down the priest's stair, a turning stone screw so tight that Ethan had to go sideways, past the cold chapel where a Blackwood had once hidden a hunted clergyman for a fortnight, to the low chapel door that no one had bothered to guard, because no one in 100 years had remembered it was a door. It opened onto the stable yard and a wall of falling snow. The grooms had been drawn off to the front of the house by the noise. Ethan, in his shirt sleeves now, the cold not seeming to reach him at all, threw a saddle onto a tall bay thoroughbred with hands that had not forgotten how, despite the years of letting others do it. He lifted his mother up before the pommel, wrapped in his own discarded coat, and then he turned to Serafina, and for a moment, in the white storm, neither of them moved. "You could have climbed that chute alone and been gone," he said. "You owed us nothing. You owe this house nothing." "I know it," she said. He set his hands at her waist and lifted her up behind his mother as though she weighed no more than the old woman did, and swung up himself, and as the bay broke from the yard into the blinding moor, he understood, with a clarity that startled him, that he was not riding away only to save his mother's life. They rode through the night with the storm at their backs, and did not stop until the bay was blowing hard and Lady Rosalind had gone silent and grey against her son's chest. The White Hart stood 20 miles south of Blackwood Land, a low coaching inn of black timber and yellow lamplight, its yard rutted with the frozen tracks of the mail. Ethan did not give his name. A duke arriving on a lathered horse with a half-dead old woman and a soot-blackened girl would be talked of in every tap-room between here and York within the day, and Hargrave would buy that talk for the price of an ale. So he became a Mr. Ash, a merchant whose mother had taken ill on the road, and he paid for a private parlor and a chamber above it with coin from a purse he was careful not to let the innkeeper see the weight of. The innkeeper's wife, a broad and incurious woman, helped them get Lady Rosalind up the narrow stair and into the bed, and asked no questions once she saw the color of Ethan's money. A surgeon was sent for from the next village.
He came near noon, set the broken ankle with a great deal of grim muttering, dressed the frostbitten foot, and said what they had all by then guessed, that the old woman's life had hung by a thread for some days, and that the thread had held only because someone had warmed and fed and tended her before the worst could finish its work. He looked at Serafina when he said it, taking her for a paid nurse, and she did not correct him. When he had gone, Lady Rosalind sank into a sleep so deep and so still that twice Serafina leaned close to be sure of her breathing. The fever had broken. The body, having delivered its message, had at last consented to rest. Down in the parlor the fire had been built high, and for the first time in 3 days there was nothing to run from in the next minute. Serafina had washed at the basin in the corner. The soot of the chute came off her in grey water, and her own face emerged from under it. Younger than the manor had let her look, the line of her jaw and the set of her eyes no longer hidden behind grime and a mob cap. When she turned from the basin, she found the Duke watching her, and he glanced away too late to pretend he had not been. "Your arm," he said, to have something to say. "You've been favoring it since the shoot." She had not meant for anyone to notice. There was a gash along her forearm from a snag of broken brick, crusted now and stiff, and she had tied her own torn sleeve over it and thought no more about it because there had been a duchess to carry and a moor to cross. Ethan took her wrist before she could draw it back. He had a strip of clean linen from the innkeeper's wife and a basin of warmed water, and he sat her down by the fire and cleaned the wound himself, frowning over it. His hands, which had signed treaties and turned beggars from no gate, but had certainly never done this, careful and slow. "You should let me," she said. "It isn't proper, a gentleman doing a servant's." "You climbed a 30-year chute in the dark for a woman you had been told would cost you your place," he said, not looking up from the binding. "I think we are some distance past what is proper." She watched the top of his bent head and did not know what to do with the strange ache his care set going under her ribs. "In London," he said, after a while, still working the linen round her arm, "I am surrounded by people who want a great many things from me. Land, favor, a daughter married well, my voice in a vote. I have grown so used to it that I had stopped believing a person could do a thing for no return at all." He tied off the binding and looked up, and the firelight took the tiredness out of his face and left only the man. "And then I find one scrubbing my steps, who spent her last candle on a stranger and would have taken the workhouse herself before she let it take my mother. You did not know what she was worth. That is the whole of it. You did not know, and you did it anyway." "There was no one else going to," Serafina said simply. "That's all it ever was." "It is not all it was." He had not let go of her hand, and seemed only now to notice it, and still did not let go. "When this is finished, when Hargrave answers for what he has done, and he will answer for it, I make you a promise, and I have broken very few in my life. You will never scrub another step. You will never serve another soul as long as you live, not in my house, not in any house." The fire cracked. Above them, the old woman slept on, safe, and outside, the snow went on falling over a country that did not yet know any of them were alive. Hargrave's reach was longer than 20 miles, and they had been fools to forget it. The plan, made by firelight while Lady Rosalind slept, had seemed sound. The old woman could not be moved far on horseback, not with a freshly set ankle, and a duke could not gather men against his own steward without an authority higher than his own word. There was such an authority in the county, the Lord Lieutenant, the king's own man, who held the loyalty of the regiment quartered at York, and who had known the late duke as a friend. Reach him, and Hargrave's bought constables and hired thugs counted for nothing against royal dragoons.
The mail coach passed the White Hart before dawn each day on its run toward the city. 3 more passengers in the cold dark would draw no eye. So they thought. They took the mail at first light, Lady Rosalind muffled to the eyes in borrowed shawls and named again as the merchant's ailing mother, Seraphina, and Ethan a son and his wife. The coach was a battered old thing, all worn leather and a guard with a blunderbuss who looked like he had never fired it and hoped never to. For an hour it ground south through a country gone white and silent, the only sound the harness and the wheels biting frost, and Seraphina let herself, for that hour, believe. The turnpike ran straight there, between 2 old stone walls, with a stand of ancient oaks where the road dipped to a frozen ford. Hargrave's man had chosen the place a day in advance, which was the measure of him. He had not chased them. He had simply asked himself where they must go, and gone there first. The shot came from the oaks and took the lead horse through the chest. The animal went down screaming, and the coach drove up over it and slewed and turned, and the world became a tumbling of splintered wood and harness and cold sky. Seraphina was thrown clear into a drift that knocked the breath out of her. The guard's blunderbuss went off into the air as he fell and was not heard from again. When she came up onto her knees, ears ringing, there were 4 men coming down through the trees with the unhurried walk of men who had been promised payment and meant to earn it cleanly. Ethan was already out of the wreck and on his feet in the snow. She had never seen him like this. The weary man of the library, the careful man at the firelit basin, was gone, and in his place was something colder and far older. The thing that ran in the blood of men whose fathers and grandfathers had held land by holding it. He had a flintlock pistol from his coat, and he did not waste it. He let the first man come close enough that there could be no missing, and there was no missing. And then the pistol was empty and useless, and there were 3 men left, and only his hands. It was not the clean business of a story. It was ugly and close and brief. Men slipping on iced ground, the wet sound of a fist finding a face, a knife that came out and was turned. Ethan fought the way a man fights when his mother is bleeding tired in an overturned coach behind him. Without flourish and without mercy, and with the whole of himself. He put 2 of them down. The third he did not see. Seraphina did. The man had come round the wreck of the coach while Ethan's back was to it, a heavy iron bar from the broken axle in both hands, raised 3 steps away and closing. There was no time to call out that would not come too late. There was a carriage iron in the snow by her knee, the long crank the guard had used to lock the brake, flung free in the crash. She did not decide to pick it up so much as find it already in her hands and herself already moving, and she swung it the way she had swung a coal shovel 1,000 frozen mornings, with her shoulders and her whole weight behind it, and it took the man across the back of the skull and folded him into the drift without a sound. She stood over him, shaking, the iron still gripped, white-knuckled, breath sawing in her chest. Ethan turned at the sound and saw the man down and the maid standing above him with the brake iron in her 2 hands, and for a moment neither of them could find anything to say to it. Then Lady Rosalind, dragged half out of the broken coach by the cold and the noise, made a small sound and slid down into the snow in a faint, her newly set ankle taking her weight wrong, and there was no more time for what could not be said. "She can't take another mile of road," Ethan said, kneeling, gathering his mother up. The remaining coach horse stood trembling in its tangled traces, no use for riding double, and the dead road behind them would bring more of Hargrave's men before it brought help. He looked west, where the white land fell away toward a flatness too smooth and too pale to be a field. "Then we go on foot," Seraphina said, "and we go across that." The flatness was the black mere, frozen, and a mile of it lay between them and the far shore.
The Black Mere had drowned men in every generation that had lived beside it, and the people of the Dale knew better than to set foot on it before deep winter had had a month to work. It had not had a month. The cold snap was barely a week old. But the road behind them was a dead road, with Hargrave's men somewhere upon it, and the old woman could not be carried 20 miles to York, and the far shore, a low, dark line of alders against the failing light, could be reached in an hour across the ice, or not at all. There was no good choice. There was only the ice or the men, and the men did not care whether the Blackwoods lived. Ethan went first, his mother held against his chest, because he was the heaviest, and if the ice would not bear him, it would bear no one, and better to know it at the edge than the middle. The surface near the bank was thick and gray and held. 20 yards out, it began to talk, long, groaning notes that traveled away under their feet and came back, the sound a vast, frozen thing makes when it is asked to do more than it wishes to.
"Spread apart," Seraphina said. "Don't walk in his steps. Don't bunch. The weight has to lie wide or it goes through." She had this knowledge the way she had all her knowledge, not from books, but from a life lived close to hard things. The undergardener at Blackwood had crossed a flooded weir in a thaw and gone under and not come up, and she had heard the men who pulled for his body talk all winter of how he had been bunched with 2 others on a single span. She made Ethan go left, and she went right, and they crossed the white mile strung apart like beads, the dark line of the alders coming no nearer for a long time, and then, slowly, nearer. The light was nearly gone when she heard the men behind them, 3 of them, on the bank they had left, shouting to one another in the dusk. They did not hesitate at the edge the way wise men would. They had been paid, and a paid man at the end of a long, cold chase does not stop to read the color of ice. They came on, all 3 together, fast, gaining, because they were not carrying an old woman, and not picking their footing, and not afraid. "Don't look back," Ethan said. "The shore, only the shore." They were perhaps 200 yards from the alders when the ice beneath Lady Rosalind's sun gave its first true crack. Not the long groan now, but a sharp report, and a black line that ran out from his boot like a thing alive and forked. He went down to spread his weight, his mother sliding from his arms onto the surface, and for a moment all 3 of them lay flat on the cracking glass with the dark water breathing somewhere beneath.
"She can't lie here," Seraphina said. "It's coldest where it's thinnest. Give her to me." "You'll go through. You're twice my weight and hers together. It's me or it's all of us." She was already moving, low, flat, hauling herself across the ice on her elbows toward the old woman. "Crawl wide, crawl slow, don't stand." She got her arms under Lady Rosalind, and she did not lift her. Lifting was weight in one place, and weight in one place was death here. She dragged her, the 2 of them spread along the ice like something poured across it, an inch and an inch and an inch toward the black line of trees, while behind them the running men came on, and the running men did not crawl. The ice took them. It did not crack for the 3 of them the way it had cracked for Ethan, in a line that warned. It simply opened, all at once, a whole black mouth of it where their 3 bunched weights came down running together, and the dusk took the sound of it and made it small, and then there was no more shouting on the mere at all. The water closed gray over where they had been, and smoothed and was still, and the cold went on as if nothing had been added to it. Seraphina did not stop dragging until her hands found frozen reed, and then frozen mud, and then the solid, root-bound bank of the alder shore, and she pulled the old woman up into the dead bracken and lay there with her chest heaving and could not, for a moment, make any part of herself move. Ethan came off the ice a dozen yards down and crossed to them on hands and knees and gathered them both in against him, his mother and the girl, in the last of the light, with the wind coming hard off the water that had just taken 3 men and given him back the two he could not have borne to lose. "It is over," he said into Seraphina's soot-stained hair, and his arms did not loosen. "Whatever else this costs, you will not be a servant when it is done. You have my word, and you have had it twice now, and a man does not give it 3 times." The dark closed in, and they did not let go of one another against the cold. Mr. Hargrave had a great deal to be pleased about, and he was the kind of man who counted his pleasures. The Duke had not returned, no body had been found, but bodies were not always found on the moor in winter, and a mail coach lay smashed on the turnpike with a dead horse and a missing guard, which told its own story to anyone who did not already know the true one. The servants had been calmed, the constables had been paid. The tale was set firm now, a deranged scullery maid, a hostage-taking, a tragedy of the lower orders, and Hargrave had spent the morning in the Blackwood library, in the Blackwood chair, drawing up the papers by which the management of an heirless estate would pass, regrettably and entirely lawfully, into the steward's careful hands. He was still holding the pen when the dragoons came up the avenue. The Lord Lieutenant of the county was an old man with a soldier's spine and no patience at all for being woken before dawn at a wayside inn by a duke he had buried in his own mind years before. But he had known the late duke, and he had known the dowager when she was young, and a man does not forget a face he has danced with, even when 40 winters have been laid over it. He had listened. He had looked long at the broken old woman who named the night of her own false death, and the road it had happened on, and the man who had paid for it. And then he had called for his horse and his regiment, and ridden north with a cold and terrible cheerfulness, because there are few things an old soldier enjoys more than the unmaking of a comfortable thief. They did not arrest Hargrave at Blackwood. The lieutenant would not have it so common. He had him brought, instead, to the courtroom of his own estate at York, a high, sunlit room of dark oak and tall windows, full of the county's gentry, who had been summoned without being told why, and who therefore came, as gentry will, in a state of delicious unease. Hargrave was walked in still believing, almost to the last, that this was some confusion he could ledger his way out of. He had an explanation ready. He always had an explanation ready. He got as far as the first sentence of it. Then the side door opened, and the Duke of Blackwood walked into the room, alive, in a borrowed coat that did not fit him, with a scullery maid on one side, and, leaning on a stick, the Dowager Duchess of Blackwood on the other. Whatever Hargrave had been about to say went out of him like air from a cut bladder. The whole room was on its feet. Some old woman near the front began to weep at the sight of a face she had mourned. The lieutenant let the noise run a moment, the way a man lets a fire draw, and then he silenced it with one lifted hand and said only, "Madam, if you would." Lady Rosalind did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She told the room the road, the hour, the false coffin, the years behind a locked door under a name not her own, and she told them who had paid for all of it, and she told it plainly, an old woman in a borrowed shawl who had walked the length of England to be standing where she stood. There was no defense against it. A bought constable might be doubted, a tenant's word might be bent. There is nothing a man can ledger against a woman risen from her own grave to point at him across a sunlit room. Hargrave was taken out in irons, high treason against the peerage and the attempted murder of 3 souls upon the King's Road. The gallows waited for him, with no great hurry and no great doubt. And the county gentry went home that evening with the only story they would tell at any table for a year. It was a month later, and the snow long gone to mud, and then to the first hard green of a Yorkshire spring, that the same gentry came together again, and the peerage of half of England with them, for word of this had travelled to London, and well beyond.
The cathedral was full.
Serafina came up the long aisle in white silk that had been her own only since the morning, with the old diamonds of the House of Blackwood at her throat, the dowager's own, pressed into her hands by an old woman who said she had no daughter, and now, it seemed, did. There was no soot on her, and no mob cap, and no pail. She walked steady, the way she had walked across a mile of breaking ice, and she did not look down. Ethan waited at the altar and watched her come, and did not seem able to believe his fortune any more on that day than he had in a firelit parlor with her wrist in his hands. She had given a freezing stranger a shawl and a candle and her place in the world, asking nothing, not even a name. The world had given it all back to her with both hands. And the people of the North, who tell their winter stories slowly and keep them long, never afterward called her anything but the heroine who would not let an old woman die at the gate.